order and welcome to the first public session of the committee's inquiry into algorithms, social media and the summer riots. So we're here today to talk about algorithms used by social media platforms and search engines and how they can spread misinformation. Now, our inquiry was sparked in part by the riots of last summer, which followed the horrendous killing of 3 young girls in Southport on 29th July. So I do want to remind the members of this committee and our witnesses that despite yesterday's developments, legal proceedings relating to this case are not complete. And under the sub judice rule, the House and its committees should not discuss in public matters awaiting judgment in UK courts in order to avoid prejudicing legal proceedings. So in the session, members and witnesses must not speculate or express views as to sentencing in this case, wider discussions of events around the case, such as misinformation and how it spread online about the person who has been prosecuted, is acceptable. I note that this morning the Prime Minister announced an inquiry into the Southport killings and did note that it's frustrating that different rules currently appear to apply to online content where different information is able to spread. With that, I'd also like to welcome to the committee Paul War, who is guesting, and he's a member of the Culture, Media and Sports Committee, and is guesting on our evidence session this morning. So let us welcome our first panel, which is made up of 3 witnesses. We have Kelly Chequer, the Councillor for Sunderland City Council, Zara Mohammed, Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain, and Ravishaan Muthiah, Director of Communications at the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. And I have a question. I would like to kick off by asking you each in turn to answer a question. We have very little time for this session, and it's such a large subject to discuss. So I'm going to ask you each to be brief in your responses, maximum of a minute. But my question is quite general. Can you sort of precise what you felt the impact of the summer 2024 unrest was on the communities that you represent? And specifically, and I'll start with you if you don't mind, Councillor Chequer, what intelligence did you have of what was happening on social media in order to help you to prepare for it? So we'll start with Councillor Chequer and then go to Ms. Mohammed and Mr. Muthiah.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to you today. I am the Deputy Leader of Sunderland City Council, and I was the political lead during our troubles on the 2nd of August last year. In terms of the impact on our communities, I don't think we can understate the impact on our communities, particularly our Muslim communities who were targeted throughout the violence, and including a specific attack on a mosque. The impact of that on our communities has been extreme, and I know that the communities are welcoming the work that's happening both locally and nationally to try and address that. But I think the emotions that people feel, particularly around the spread of the online information and the hate as an underlying cause for this, is something that is of extreme concern across all of the communities. In terms of the intelligence, Chair, as the acting leader of the council at the time and the police, we worked very, very closely together, and the police were in the same challenge that we were, in that we were getting a lot of misinformation and almost, we believe, intentionally false information via social media about planned unrest, including incorrect convening dates, times, venues, etc. So that meant that both the police and I had very little in terms of intelligence of how we could manage this situation, what the scale of it was going to be, what the intention of it was going to be, and therefore made it very challenging to police and manage that in our communities accordingly.
Thank you very much. So it seems as if there was almost organised misinformation that you feel that you were suffering from. If I could turn to you, Ms. Mohammed.
Chair, members of Parliament, thank you so much for having me. Zara, Mohammed, Secretary General. I was also leading and coordinating at the time. For us, there was 3 levels to this. In terms of impact, completely devastating. Nationally, Muslim communities were in collective fear, collective trauma, even if they were not in areas that were being attacked. As Councillor rightly said, they were receiving information that their mosque was going to be targeted. The second perspective we look at is how quickly the misinformation was able to attribute to very specific mosques and very specific localities. So it felt very real. They knew the names of the mosques, they knew the locations. Not even some Muslims knew where these mosques were. They were very organised in their time specificity. But also we were watching in live time, particularly on X, what was happening through other platforms. So there was, and the algorithms were boosting that, so you were seeing more of what you hate and also more of what was targeting you. So communities were now viewing in real time Hull, or the refugees being attacked, or cars being stopped, or mosques being arson attempts in Sunderland. So we were in contact, because we're in a massive network of associations and mosques, we are in real time contacting these institutions. Do you know if anything's happening? Are you okay? We spoke with Southport, we spoke with Sunderland, but we spoke to more or less every mosque impacted. And then the third side of this was around action and response. So there were figures like Tommy Robinson, for example, and others who were being boosted on the platform, and messages of what they were saying were then enticing others. So anytime we posted safety guidance, there would be a stream of hate on our comments and posts, me personally. So the point I was going to make, is that it made it challenging for us to locally support with the police and with other associations. So we put on lots of safety webinars, but where there were strong relationships with local communities and mosques, that was a lot more effective. But where there was weaknesses and gaps, and also smaller police forces that weren't well equipped to manage. And then finally, in an atmosphere of heightened fear and anxiety, people were really just very, very scared and did not know. So we in some ways were amplifying fear, even when we weren't trying to.
Right, okay, it's an important point. Mr. Muthiah?
Thank you to the committee for having me. So at the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, we represent migrants across the country, and whether it was people that were in accommodation that we represent, or people that were very near to asylum accommodations, these attacks totally devastated and traumatized our communities. I want to give one clear example of someone that was traumatized and tell you, her story. So one example is our client Alia. So she was afraid to leave her asylum accommodation during the riots. She's a former professional volleyball player who fled Iraq in May 2022 when she faced death threats, and she was detained for deportation to Rwanda in 2023. So she's someone who has a lot of trauma already, and she'd come to this country for safety. She's someone who's very vulnerable. She'd made multiple suicide attempts. And after the riots, she told us in her own words, "I'm so scared that this is going to happen to me. I cry every night. The Home Office didn't protect me. They didn't understand my situation. I came here to be safe, not belittled or threatened. It's not too much to ask." She said, "I think English people hate me." If we need any example of what these riots did to our communities, especially migrant communities, this is one. I think the environment that was created by politicians, by social media companies, by the police, the Home Office and the far right enabled these riots. And this is sort of one example of the traumatic impact that this violence had on our communities. The good news is Alia has now been granted refugee status. But on that journey, she was re-traumatized on our shores. Right. And I think we really, as this committee, need to take a hard look at why that happened. In terms of the information, I echo what Zara said. I won't go into more detail because we don't have much time, but maybe later on.
Thank you. That's a very powerful testimony. Thank you to all three of the witnesses. I'm now going to ask Alison to pose her question.
You've touched on the role of the social media already, but can you expand on what you think the social media and private messaging platforms, particularly the latter, played in driving the unrest over the summer? It's to all of you, so we'll go along. Kelly.
Thank you very much. And clearly, I'm particularly worried about the way that misinformation was circulated on closed platforms that we didn't have access to. We can easily see what happens on those open platforms, and therefore we're able to at least identify when there's misinformation, when things are spread on closed platforms, combating that and being able to challenge information that isn't true or isn't accurate becomes even more difficult. And along with our partners, we always try to encourage people to take their information from trusted sources, and that just becomes impossible in these situations. So closed systems and closed platforms are something that have been a major concern. I don't believe that the open platforms are easier for us to address, but at least we have more information, and the information we couldn't access was the ones that caused the damage.
I think what's very interesting is the use of WhatsApp, Telegram, Facebook groups, discussion forums, closed and open. Obviously X was a huge kind of force in this, where people at all ages, which is really, really important to note, we had youngsters on the street, we had parents, we had families, we had people who had businesses, people who were going to riot and attack mosques. We've travelled to Belfast as well, so and we saw the kind of damage of it. But what we found was people were able to use Islamophobic material, racist materials, xenophobic, all the kind of anti-refugee. They were using slogans and passing that misinformation very quickly through platforms to instigate hate. Some of the colleagues, Imam in Liverpool, went and asked the rioters, "Why are you doing this?" None of them mentioned Southport. So there was, in some ways, the use of the platform was a kind of propaganda of hate that kind of incited them. This is where we need to go. This is why we're doing it, which shared slogans of hate and bigotry, and particularly referencing anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia. That was a strong sentiment. So on these group chats, you would find, they were being circulated amongst Muslims, hateful, derogatory images of Muslims and of mosques that reference, over a period of 10 years, different criminal experiences or whatever. So I think the use of the platform was really, again, coordinating very quickly, but also it was to all audiences and all ages. So that therefore shows it wasn't a very specific audience, but maybe ideologically driven or not, but they were sharing this information very quickly and very widely.
I think it's, both Kelly and Zara have talked about the instant messaging, and I think I can shine a bit more of light on the social media platforms, because we had a lot of hate during the riots. So I think it's really clear that social media platforms enable the spread of anti-migrant rhetoric, racist sentiments, and it really emboldened those who have been radicalised by years of anti-migrant policies and rhetoric to then take to the streets. So I think it's really important as well for this committee to think about the algorithms which promoted engagement and content with the most impressions. So this led to these algorithms platforming posts which encouraged violence against migrant communities. And this viral content and this viral spread of information really does act like a virus would. So, for example, there are super spreaders. We know what super spreaders are from COVID-19. There are super spreaders such as Tommy Robinson, such as politicians, such as tabloid newspapers, and they use these digital platforms to spread the virus of misinformation. On top of that, like a virus, this information, it then mutates. So it changes, it amplifies, it becomes more dangerous and has more cut through with people as it gets amplified by more and more people. And this creates what we had in the riots, which was extreme information disorder. That's what we saw. And we know that social media companies and search engines that rely on engagement and impressions to boost their own advertising revenue, they're less likely to moderate this high engagement content. So this ultimately leads to the loudest and the most polarizing views receiving the most digital airtime. So we've seen more and more digital content which targets communities like ours. We've seen this much more on X or Twitter since Elon Musk's takeover, and it's become a really dangerous place for our communities. There's been a massive spike in racist and anti-migrant posts on the platform. But this content generates revenue and engagement for these companies. Right. So they willingly turn a blind eye, and it's clear that this business model that social media has creates the worst environment for people. But I just wanted to say one last thing. Sorry, I know you want to get in.
Yes. So I just have one follow-up. Yes. So
one last point is that, in this case, X was the message carrier. And if pigeons, like in the olden days, were the message carrier, would we blame the pigeons? I don't think we would. I don't think we'd be blaming pigeons and having a committee about pigeons. But we need to look at society as a whole. Of course, we need to look at X. But these messages were created offline. They were created in the media. They were created, sadly, by some of our politicians. So we need to really deal with far-right radicalisation that is happening online on digital communities as well.
Linked to that, having identified the issue, what should be done to prevent this from happening again, and who should be held responsible for this spread of this information?
I'm only going to give you a few seconds to answer.
If we go along from Ravishaan to Zara and then Kelly.
Yeah, well, I think, the platforms must be controlled, as I said. It's really clear that we need to control platforms. We need to really have some strong controls on politicians and the language that they use, which is then used on these platforms, traditional media and other sources of disinformation and hate speech. We've done some studies and research at JCWI, which has found the language that is used by traditional media or politicians is then echoed on digital media and then back again. It's a loop of hate. So it's not one. We have to really deal with hatred wherever it comes up.
Okay. I think it's multi-pronged. I think obviously there is the social media platforms, there's a level of regulation and accountability, there's political figures, but ultimately it's about empowering the user. And as you said, the hate itself is already there. But how do we empower young people to understand, don't share? So even me sharing it made it worse, right? Because I'm sharing it to my colleagues to say, have you seen this? And then that's boosting the platform, and then everybody's... So I think, and then Sky News or other channels are sharing it. So we are all sharing the content, which is saying to the algorithm, oh, this must be really good content, let's share it more. So I think we've got to look at the user, the young people, the communities we're trying to protect and empower, but also us. We're part of the story. So how are we managing the story? There's only a certain level of regulation you can really go to, and even political speech. But it's that polarisation. We're losing the middle ground of dialogue, conversation, debate.
Thank you. I think how we should respond to algorithms when we don't actually know what is in how the algorithm work is a really important question, which we'll pursue. Councillor Chequer.
Thank you very much. And I think I echo my colleagues' statements around the social media and the algorithm sharing the information facilitated the organisation of the unrest, particularly in our communities. And the circulation of misinformation fermented the unrest, but it'd be wrong to think that it actually caused the unrest. And so there needs to be two approaches here. We need to be targeting how this information is shared, and it should be challenged, and there needs to be more opportunity for people to be able to remove factually incorrect information, but also we need to try and understand the causes of the unrest, in our communities, because they are complex, and in our case particularly, they're not recent.
And who do you think should be held responsible for this, held accountable for this misinformation spread?
The social media platforms that are enabling this, without a doubt.
Thank you. Again, it's worth saying in this context that the LinkedIn post, which falsely claimed the alleged attacker was a migrant, was shared more than 2 million times before being taken down. Now, Lauren, did you want to come in very briefly? And then we have Paul and then Steve.
Yeah, no, sure. It was just the question about business models. And I think you touched on it just there about the business models of algorithms, and actually the social media would like people to be looking and watching. And so is this part of promoting the harmful and misleading content, do you think?
Yeah, I think when there's a platform that has a business model which is all about engagement, which boosts their advertising revenue, then no matter what the content is, if it's getting high engagement, it will continue to leave that content on and turn a blind eye until, like the chair said, it got 2 million views before it was taken down, until there is wider action or stronger repercussions for those businesses. And at this moment in time, there aren't strong repercussions for businesses that are promoting this sort of hateful content.
Okay, I'm going to ask Paul to come in now.
Hi, Zara. Many of my constituents of South Asian heritage in Rochdale felt very, very scared last summer and vulnerable. They were very grateful to the Home Office for swiftly providing security in many mosques. But can I ask you in particular, What's the link between social media hate and violence against Muslims in particular, and how different is it from ordinary Islamophobia, as we call it like that, amongst the mainstream media and maybe newspapers?
Yeah, well, thank you, Paul, for your leadership, particularly at that time. It's the power of the anonymous, you know? You can really hate as much as you like without accountability. And Islamophobia gets lots of clicks, and it's perpetuated at lots of levels. So 40% of all religiously motivated hate crime, that's physical stuff we can see, is against Muslim communities. But online, how do we evidence it? There's so much hate and vitriol I personally get, colleagues get, our parliamentary colleagues get, but no accountability. You know, politicians fear for their life, but Muslim women in particular fear even more gender Islamophobia. So for us, it is a Wild West in some ways, but also Islamophobia sells. And the worst thing about the riots it really showed is how much people were galvanised on this hatred towards Muslims. And it was perpetuating these bias and stereotypes that already existed, and not in a vacuum. This is a context. You could say it's a post 9/11 year. You could talk about, even before that. But really there is a kind of global phenomenon of this idea that a normalization of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred. So 2 quick points I wanted to make. There was a lack of narrative of belonging. You know, people couldn't call it, this was Islamophobic hate. You know, they didn't want to call the riots out for what they actually were, but they were coming from us and coming from Muslims. Then there was this kind of the government action, and we really welcome the protective security. Many mosques are where elderly people go, where women go, for after-school classes for kids. They're not fortresses of protection. So when that protection finally came in, great, but it showed the weakness in the system, that nobody even thought Muslims could actually be attacked. And we'd had so much vandalisms and lots of things happening on the back of any bad news story. And so what we really feel is that actually the latent issue of Islamophobia hasn't adequately been addressed. And in these pocket north towns, things were bubbling. And actually, unfortunately, that just came out and spilled out on the street. So I think there's something much bigger we've got to take home. And for British Muslims, unfortunately, the riots have left quite a big scar. And there's a lack of real action and long-term strategy on what are we going to do to tackle Islamophobia and not make us a security issue or an immigration issue, which is what the riots are really pointing at.
Thank you. Steve, would you like to come in?
Thank you. And to Ravishaan, it's a similar question, but to do with the migrant community in the UK. So what do you think are the patterns and the impacts between sort of social media, hate speech and violence there, but also looking to protections under the law? Do you think that protections, particularly under the sort of Online Safety Act, do they go far enough? Where is the line between sort of unlawful behaviour, unlawful sort of speech versus sort of harmful as well?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a clear link between years of hate speech towards migrants and migrant communities and the violence we saw towards these same people in the riots in August 2024. And, while organisations like our own have seen this and known this, I think that those riots show clear evidence to all of us how dangerous this hate speech is to all of us and all of our communities. In terms of the question directly and what social media, how that affects people on the ground and how that moves from the digital space to the street space, we've done some recent studies and we found that on Facebook, the mere mention of immigration leads to many comments, many responses, and that can be generally a lot of hateful comments. So, for example, we found that there's a massive amount of mis- and disinformation on social media platforms about immigration, and that this is a leading contributor to the hate and intolerance towards migrants. And we've seen that the language of right-wing influencers, as I mentioned earlier, is parroted online and then it's parroted back on the tabloid press. So, for example, some of the comments that we've seen are comments which talk about mass deportations, talking about people that come to our country as illegal invaders, as scroungers, as parasites. So these are some of the comments, just a few of the comments that come up. We've also seen a sharp rise in AI content across social media, and that's a massive worry, and I think something this committee should look at, because that has meant that there's been an ability for people to create false images that spread far and wide and really do convince many people, people of all persuasions on the internet, that the image is correct. So without clearly defining AI content as AI generated, and without having clear checks on AI generated content, we're just going to see a proliferation of more of this content. So
are you asking for that content to be made illegal in some sense, or for the phrase such as alien invaders or parasites?
Yeah, well, I think
that isn't legal speech, would you agree?
I mean, this sort of speech shouldn't be allowed in society generally, I would say. You know, there's a certain level of hate speech that appears online that we wouldn't accept if it appeared on the street. There's a certain amount of discriminatory language, again, that appears online that we wouldn't accept. And I think the way that we deal with that speech online needs to be much firmer. So coming on to the second part of your question about the Online Safety Act, you know, we would say that at the moment, are migrants provided enough safety? The blunt answer is no. They're not providing enough safety online, nor are our communities. Is the Online Safety Act a good move in the right direction? Potentially, yes. But there's a difference between the Act and the enforcement of the Act. So what will Ofcom's role be with the Act? Will they be able to have greater restrictions on social media companies? At the moment, the context is quite worrying. Mark Zuckerberg is moving Facebook away from fact checkers. X has moved away from that. Our own Prime Minister has been attacked by the head of a social media company, and the social media companies in America are very close to the government, as we saw by the presidential inauguration yesterday. So it's a really worrying time. So I think there needs to be clear action from our government and from our politicians urgently.
Could I just follow up very quickly on that before I move on to Kelly? You have quite a nuanced view, I think, rightly, about whether social media is just the newest incarnation of the mass media and previous, and about the interaction with society as well. And so, do you think is it more important to regulate social media kind of content, or is it more important or as important to sort of work with communities in the UK around around language generally and around acceptance?
I think we have to do both at the same time. If we're to tackle racism or anti-migrant hatred, we have to both tackle it online and we have to tackle it in the general public via traditional media and any other ways. I think if we close one angle, which is the digital, it will just appear somewhere else. So we have to do it everywhere.
Need to move on. Steve.
Thank you. And then Kelly, just from a local government perspective, how well do you think you are equipped and local authorities are equipped to sort of deal with, deal with online misinformation, disinformation, given that often you will be at the forefront of dealing with this first and foremost as you see it coming?
Thank you very much. And I echo my colleagues' comments about the concerning nature of this and the challenges that were posed both nationally and locally. Within local government, we have no more powers than any other individual to get content removed from an online platform. So that in itself presents a real challenge. And our ask is that local governments are given more power to enable us to counter, to challenge, to remove misinformation and harmful content when it appears online. I'd also like to see us being able to work with communities. Things like the Online Safety Act are very welcome, but like my colleagues have said, it's the enforcement of all of these things at both a national and a local level that we have those concerns around, and those powers need to be there to enable us to challenge these things promptly, and also to ensure that our communities are engaged and kept up to date with these things, so that these things, because often it is our communities that hear about these things first, they can be a very useful source of information, and we should be welcoming that.
Thank you. We're running late, so just a couple
Thanks,
of
Chair.
minutes.
Yes, a question to all three of you, but let's be brief as possible because of the time constraints. Specifically, were you satisfied with the government's response to social media around the unrest last summer? Maybe we'll start with Kelly this time.
The government's response to social media was very difficult, and I think they felt the same frustrations that we did. I was very satisfied with the government's response to the unrest and to their support for us as a city. We had excellent support both throughout the entire scenario, but they were in no better position than we were to be able to challenge the social media and clearly weren't able to act to help us to prevent the violence that we saw in Sunderland on the 2nd of August.
Thank you.
Well, in brief, no. It was, I don't know what the response was, if I'm honest. I think narrative is really important. So obviously there was the justice deterrent, which we saw that had to be done physically, but online it was very hostile, very Islamophobic. The dehumanisation of Muslims was carrying on, and groups were allowed to very, very quickly organise. The police didn't know if it was real or not real, and I think there were so many weaknesses around the chain, and in lifetime communities, Muslim communities in particular, are watching and saying, why isn't anybody doing anything about this? So I think there was some really, really big shortcomings, and the government was very unprepared. But also, where is that team that really knows, even in policing, who's responsible for making sure when communities are at risk as they were in live time, able to respond? And most of those police forces were very small, you know. And what could they really do? So yeah, I think that's something that's a huge area that needs to be tackled.
Thanks, Zara. Ravishaan.
From our perspective and the perspective of our communities, it's really impossible to be satisfied with the government's response to the social media activity which led to the riots in August 2024. The damage both physically and emotionally to our communities was exacerbated by the government's inaction. In fact, the government's response to social media activity which caused the summer 24 riots were utterly woeful, and we would even say it verges on a dereliction of duty to the communities we serve. It felt to many of us and the migrant communities we serve that the government sat by and allowed the violence to intensify day on day. Many were practically begging for support from the government as our safety was put at risk. The statements were slow, and how can it be possible that the riots rumbled on for so many days? So I don't think you need me to say that it was a failure. The evidence speaks for itself. And social media activity that started the fire, which led to the riots, and the large accounts which spread the mis and disinformation were allowed to continue spreading this hate speech and incite violence throughout the far-right riots. So there was no meaningful social media enforcement against this hate speech.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for your candour. Given Kelly's point about how the government doesn't have a huge amount of control over what these social media companies can do, but I completely accept the points you make, Zara and Ravishaan, about you're not happy with the government's response. What would you have wanted to see on top of what was done?
30 seconds.
All it needed was counter-narrative. There was no narrative of belonging. There was no narrative to say, this doesn't represent our Britain. There was no narrative to even say Islamophobia.
Thank you.
So I would second that. I think the government could have been much clearer and much louder quite earlier. I would also say that there could be more enforcement and more accountability on social media companies very early, and those hateful platforms and individuals on those on those platforms. The accounts need to be shut down very quickly, and if they were, I think there could have been a much quicker end to the violence and end to the mis and disinformation and hate speech online.
If I might, I would just like to offer a slightly different view. That is that where we saw in the days following the unrest in Sunderland, where we saw positive action from police forces that were shared on social media, we had a significant threat of further violence in the days that followed, and particularly there was a specific threat on an asylum seeking processing centre in our city. That did not occur, and I believe that was in part by positive messaging both locally and nationally through social media, and there was at that stage a narrative of, if you do this there will be consequences, which spread well across social media.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all of our panel for sharing their experiences of the impact of the spread of misinformation over the summer and the unrest in their communities. It's clear that the impact was significant, that there is people are still traumatized by that impact, that damage, both in personal and in economic terms, was significant, and there are questions for this committee and for the government with regard to how the misinformation was allowed to spread so quickly, what speedy response there could have been. Councillor Chequer, I'm very impressed by what you said about the cooperation that with the police and government and local authority, which helped reduce ongoing impact. But I also recognise, Mr. Mohammed and Mr. Muthiah, what you said about the way in which we were all part of spreading those misinformation to some extent, and we also need to address that. But thank you very much for sharing your experience, and order. Order. And welcome to our second panel in this morning's session on algorithms, social media and the summer riots. Now, earlier we heard from representatives of those impacted by the summer unrest. Now we are welcome a panel of experts in some of the reasons and of how the misinformation spread and what the challenges are in addressing it. And I'm going to again start by addressing a question to all the panel. So I'll just briefly introduce them. We have Imran Ahmed, who is the CEO for the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. We have Dr. Joe Whittaker, who is a lecturer at the School of Social Science Cyber Threats Research Centre at Swansea University. And joining us exceptionally early from the United States, we have Mariana Spring, who is the disinformation and social media correspondent of the BBC. Now, as I said, we heard earlier from the profound impact that the unrest over the summer had on communities in this country. What I would like each of you to say to me as briefly as possible. We have a lot of interest, obviously, in this subject, but is to answer the question. How far do the business models of social media platforms promote the spread of harmful or misleading content, and as specifically as you can, in a short period of time, how they do that, how they promote that spread? And I'm going to ask Mr. Ahmed, and then Ms. Spring, and then Dr. Whittaker. So, Mr. Ahmed, can I start with you?
Good morning, panel. My name's Imran Ahmed. I'm founder and CEO of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. Just by way of background, CCDH was set up because the fundamental physics of how information is shared in our society, in how we negotiate our social mores, are...
So that should help you to answer the question. Great.
Yeah, our values and even how we negotiate the corpus of information that we call facts has shifted to online spaces. Looking at the unrest this summer, it was both profoundly shocking but predictable and unsurprising, in that an incident in which violence was inculcated through the spread of disinformation, acute disinformation, was both an entirely predictable feature of the design of social media platforms, which aren't designed to be spaces in which free speech occurs. They're not designed to be spaces in which we find information that's good information, we find out the truth. They're designed to be spaces in which we spend as much time as possible in order to keep watching adverts. Truth is a really bad business model for social media platforms.
Right. So could you think about how the business model of social media platforms promotes the spread of harmful or misleading content?
I'm coming to that. And
we don't have very much time.
For example, if you went onto a social media platform and you found the truth immediately, you'd go off and do something else. So what they want to do is instead provide as broad an array of information as possible, prioritizing that which is the most emotionally engaging, that which is most predictably would lead you to respond or to spend more time trying to work out what truth there is to it. There is actually an incentive for them to pick the most engaging content. And there is also evidence provided by Mark Zuckerberg himself. So Zuckerberg a few years ago presented a chart that showed, and this I think is absolutely crucial, it cuts to the absolute core of how these platforms are designed. On the x-axis, he'd done how violative the content is, so how close it is to breaking the rules of that platform. On the y-axis, he'd plotted the engagement levels. So what you find is that it's a very flat line on engagement for low violative content, medium violative content, right as you get to the cusp of being violative. So breaking the rules of that platform, and then it shoots up with an exponential curve. Right. So what you find is that the most near violative content, and of course, we know that engagement drives amplification. And those two facts are why we see this churning of fringe, violative content into the mainstream.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to come on to... I'd like to ask Ms. Spring to respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think my answer would focus on very much how the algorithms, the recommendation systems across all of the main platforms are designed to promote engagement over safety. And what that means is that they are very much running on emotions, content that will trigger a reaction. And it's that content that will get more eyeballs, and as a consequence, the social media companies can sell more ads, they can make more money. It is just core to how they work. And almost every investigation, I'd say, or podcast series or anything that I've done over the past year has come back to that question of prioritizing engagement over safety. Obviously, and I was listening to the panel previously, and there's a lot of discussion about the riots and the impact of misleading or false or hateful information that was recommended and promoted during that time. Again, very much comes down to that question of, emotional content that triggers a reaction. I think it's also important to talk about what can incentivize users to post in that way, not only the attention and the views and the likes, but also the monetary gain. And I can talk a little bit more in detail about the way that people are able to make money from this types of content themselves, not just the social media companies. But it's also, beyond the specific situation of the riots in the summer and the shocking attacks that unfolded in Southport. There's also, there are so many examples of, for Panorama, I investigated young teenagers, young men in particular, being recommended hate and violence on social media platforms that they don't want to see. That comes again back to the algorithms prioritizing engagement over safety, pushing them content they think they will react to. A lot of the social media insiders at the companies who I've spoken to across the board have corroborated that idea and spoken more about the way that the kind of algorithmic pathways can lead people to these different places. And then also around the elections. Last year was a huge election year. And again, we saw something similar happening in terms of the proliferation of sometimes AI-generated content, unfounded conspiracy theories that played into people's existing political biases or views, and often legitimate distrust, questions, concerns that they had, but could then lead them down rabbit holes on particular social media platforms. And we're at a time, the reason I'm speaking to you from the United States is because I've been out here for Donald Trump's inauguration for the BBC's Americas podcast. And I spent a lot of time yesterday talking about the prominence of the social media bosses at that inauguration and the relationship between those tech bosses and Donald Trump. And that, in some ways, possibly marks a new era in social media where there's a lot of conversation about freedom of expression and the importance of people being able to say what they want to say on social media. And there are positives to that discussion. But some of the concerns I've heard from people affected by this kinds of content is the way that it can be seen by so many people and so many eyeballs. And that just comes back every time to the algorithms and the recommendation systems that are essential really for the social media companies to work in the way they work right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Whitaker.
I agree firmly with the two previous panelists and their points. One thing I would say is that all of these big social media platforms have spent billions, if not trillions, optimizing these recommendation algorithms, their search feeds, to as accurately as possible understand their users in the aim, exactly as Imran said, of user retention for more time on advertising. I think the most alarming thing is, because they are all AI driven, is that nobody knows how they work exactly. We know we have bits and pieces, but they are completely opaque. And when I'll talk a little bit later, I assume, about some of the research here, is even as researchers, we have very limited ideas of how these things work. When we talk about the business model, so yes, they do spend billions in terms of advertising revenue. One extremely interesting point is that there is one of the biggest platforms, Twitter X, in which users can buy algorithmic amplification, as in you pay a certain amount every month for a blue tick, and then you immediately go to the top of the feed. You are boosted. And when we look at these big disinformation incidents, and I'm assuming we'll talk about Southport and the aftermath of that, the riots, what we can see is these blue ticks are responsible for a huge amount of the misinformation that's out there. Okay. One final point, which I think is very important here, is we did talk about Mark Zuckerberg's blog post there, where he correctly makes the point that as you get, basically, content gets more and more fringe, it does increase. Now, if there was someone from a tech platform here, they would all say that they are taking active countermeasures as part of their business models to try and reduce that. So what they will all say in their site rules and their terms of service is that they are going about trying to de-rank content, make it more difficult for people to find as it gets closer to that point. I am very sceptical of that, and I think events over the last few years suggest that, trying to find the right way to put it, platforms are marking their own homework very much when it comes to reporting these kind of results.
That's something the Online Safety Act is meant to change. Now, George, do you want to indicate you want to come in here, and then we'll go to Emily?
I wanted to ask
briefly.
all three of you, as we are legislators trying to work out how we, on behalf of the public, legislate and control, I wanted to ask simply, what should we be thinking is the crime in this ecosystem? What is the act that we need to be trying to legislate against?
Great question. So, Joe?
Crime was the wrong word. The best part of the Online Safety Act is that it's what's called a systems and processes piece of legislation. It is about making sure that platforms are compliant with a certain set of rules. And in the case of the UK and the Online Safety Act, it's a very sharp divide between legal and illegal content, at least as far as adults are concerned. Children are their own measure. When we look in Europe in the Digital Services Act for these very large platforms, it's slightly more blurry, and we can talk about that as well. But yes, I think the fundamental principle when it comes to speech acts is that whatever is illegal in the offline realm should be policed in the same way in the online realm. I think that is the fundamental principle which fairly balances human rights as well as the harms that can come as a result of online speech.
Thank you. Would Imran or Mariana like to add anything briefly to that?
I'll let Mariana go first if you'd like to.
Yeah, just very quickly. I think the key really is to focus, just as was being said there, on the real world consequences of this. I always kind of caveat these answers with, I'm an investigative reporter, I'm not a campaigner, so lots of my job is about exposing the problems rather than coming up with the solutions necessarily. But what I think is really crucial is that people are listening to the people who are being harmed and affected by disinformation, hate, other kinds of content on social media, whether it's teenagers or whether it's people all across the country, across the world who are affected and feel like they're not being listened to. And for me, as a journalist, it's about accountability for the social media companies, about transparency, about feeling as though when you send them a right of reply email, you are able to get some kind of answers as to what they're doing and what's going on. I think a lot of the questions for me around the Online Safety Act come down to that.
Great, thank you.
So shortly after the riots, we convened, CCH convened a roundtable from DCIT, Home Office, Ofcom, the British advertising industry, the ISBAR, their representative body, the Met Police Counter-Terrorism Command, the anti-Semitism campaigners and Islamophobia campaigners. And we looked at what powers do we already have prior to the Online Safety Act? What powers will we have under the Online Safety Act? And then we did a gap analysis on what powers would we need in future. There are 5 recommendations we have. First one is to reintroduce the misinformation risk assessment and reporting requirements in the OSA. That could be done through a statutory instrument. The second was to increase the capacity to identify emerging harms by giving us better access to data. Now, look, one of my great frustrations with the Online Safety Act was, in fact, we don't have any transparency requirements under the Online Safety Act. They've been introduced through the Data Act subsequently, and those powers need to be enhanced further. It still is one of the weakest regimes when it comes to transparency of the algorithm, of the enforcement mechanisms, and of the advertising, which are the three crucial components to how these models work. The third is to have a crisis response mechanism for the regulator. The fourth is to close the loophole for small, high-risk platforms, which the Secretary of State has refused to do. And finally, to address the advertising and commercial incentives. Every single advertiser I've ever spoken to is outraged to know that they are essentially funding content that leads to riots in the UK. They want more transparency and control over the way that their adverts reward certain types of content.
Thank you.
And actually, by helping them to do that, we can help ourselves too.
Thank you, Emma. That's very, very important points to, I think, address some of the questions which are coming. But now I'm going to ask Emily to
with.
So firstly, Chair, I'd like to just ask Mariana, just this understanding between when it goes, misinformation goes from being online portals into mainstream media, and what is the responsibility of the mainstream media not to give air and credence to the misinformation? And we saw this in Southport, where mainstream media news sites were picking up from social media platforms targets of certain mosques that didn't end up being targets. So what is the role in mainstream media not to give air and credence to some of the misinformation online?
Thank you very much. The best way of me answering this question really is focusing on my own experience and the journalism that I do. So when it comes to covering mis and disinformation that's spreading on social media, there are two principles that I stick to in the reporting that I do. The first is understanding how viral or prevalent a piece of mis or disinformation is. Is it reaching tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, and therefore has it crossed the threshold of us needing to understand the impact it's had, because a really significant number of people have been reached or recommended or exposed to that bit of disinformation. The second thing is that I always assess is the real world consequences of that. So has that specific bit of disinformation or misinformation led to violence, or has it contributed to harming an individual or a group of people? And when either of those lines are crossed, I think it's really important that we look at and investigate what's happened. I think it's also important to think about how we do that and the approach that we take. So as I've mentioned in the kind of previous answer, focus a lot on the real world consequences of this and really kind of understanding who's affected and harmed, but then also how this has happened. So helping the audiences at the BBC, whether that's across podcasts or online or TV.
That wasn't my question. My question was, what is the responsibility of mainstream media to fact check before they spread the misinformation further, as we saw during the riots?
Yes, I appreciate that, but I can only talk about my journalism. I'm not a BBC spokesperson. So I'm talking to you about my experience of covering these kinds of stories. As ever, and I'm sure that everyone sitting in this room agree, it's really important that the media across the board get stuff right, and that they get the facts right, that they carry out all the necessary journalistic checks, whether that's speaking to people on the ground, speaking to the relevant sources and experts and everyone else about what's going on. But my experience, I very specifically focus on the spread of harmful, hateful content, disinformation on social media, and saw, particularly during the riots, how the trust that people afford to credible outlets was weaponized in so much as we saw, and I'm sure I'll talk about this in a later answer, but pseudo news sites that were sharing false allegations about the attacker in Southport, for example, which contributed to the spread of disinformation, but which people seemed ready and inclined to believe because they thought they were real. So that's more the realm that I spend my time looking at.
Thank you, Marianne. I appreciate you're not a BBC spokesperson. I do, Chair, think this is an issue that we do need to pick up in it, because that is, as we keep hearing from witnesses, one of the things that happened during the riots, and essentially gave credence to the misinformation that was online. So I have a question probably for Joe and Imran here. So all countries have governments have some kind of disinformation monitoring or networks or stuff. I'd like to understand what you think of the UK's government efforts around this. How does it compare to a country like the US in terms of how government is monitoring and taking action on disinformation on online platforms?
Sure. I mean, the US is an interesting comparison because but I mean, it's almost every other country, I would say, that we are not doing all that much. I mean, it's as I alluded to in the previous answer, the UK's approach in terms of legislation has been to demarcate very clearly the difference between legal and illegal, and I think there's actually a lot of value in that. It just leads to some unpleasant consequences. Obviously, when we talk about these sorts of things in the US, there is absolutely no attempt whatsoever to stem any kind of speech, except very, very immediate violent speech and all of the usual sorts of things like libel. But the First Amendment provides a huge amount more protection. And more importantly as well, I think when I speak to American colleagues, particularly in the US government, they also tend to take a kind of a more philosophical view of don't try and change other people's minds about stuff. So compared to America, we were actually doing a decent amount. But I think if we were to look eastwards to Europe and look at what the Digital Services Act is doing and the way that is seeking to counter disinformation on the very large platforms at least, it's considerably less. And we can see, for example, the incident in Romania with the election and the European Commission invoking the Digital Services Act to seize data from TikTok and things like that, that there is real legislative things that are being done as a result. So we are clearly doing less than the European Union, although that obviously comes with issues around free speech as well.
I mean, no government's doing it well, and all governments are to some extent reliant upon civil society and organisations like mine and ours to provide them with data and insight into what's happening on those platforms, and our ability to generate that data has been limited. Let me give two examples from the last year of why it's so difficult to get the data. One is we produced a report on X a year and a half ago which showed a rise in the prevalence of hate speech on that platform after Elon Musk took over. He subsequently sued us, not for defamation, not for being wrong, but for the act of doing research itself. Now, we won that case in California earlier last year. But nevertheless, it had a chilling effect on people even using the site to do research. His claim was essentially that terms of service of X prohibit people from doing research on that platform. You can read it, consume ads. The second would be the purchase of CrowdTangle by Meta. So CrowdTangle was the primary tool used for us to study Meta platforms. They bought it for $1 billion only so they could shut it down before the elections. So we couldn't check what was happening during the US elections last year on their platforms. So it's become incredibly difficult. The US does have quite a sophisticated apparatus for the studying of overseas disinformation networks. So the GEC, for example, which is situated in the State Department, is a relatively sophisticated outfit. We have worked with the UK government CDU, the Counter-Disinformation Unit. I've spoken to colleagues from the Home Office and other spaces in their Counter-Disinformation Unit. They are woefully underfunded. And the reliance on civil society is becoming difficult because there is a war being waged by the platforms themselves on civil society, and CCDH at the forefront of that, which is seeking to defund and close the spaces available for us to both research and communicate our evidence.
Okay, those are very important points. Thank you. And I think that the monitoring of misinformation, as Emily raised, is an important point. I'm going to go to Kit and then to Tom.
I just had a quick question, Mariana, about we've talked about misinformation, disinformation, but there's a role, is there a role to look at repetition and atmospherics? So, for example, if you look back at the 2011 riots, and now particularly on something like X, the repeated exposure, often to the same incident from different angles or different perspectives, can give the impression that it's much more long-standing or much more severe than it actually is. I mean, certainly in the 2011 riots, the role of 24-hour rolling news repeatedly showing the same footage of buildings burning in Croydon contributed to a wider sense of, or a wider kind of contagion across London. And, you know, if you are repeatedly exposed to violent incidents on X, for example, you get the impression that it's happening all the time everywhere. The other thing is, for example, if you look at the Southport riots, right, the camera footage from within the body of the riot makes it seem like a large and unpleasant incident. If you look at the drone footage from above, it's actually quite a small incident on basically one or two crossroads, and 2 streets away there's no one and nothing happening. So it's not as if the whole of Southport was consumed in the conflagration. So what is your view of the responsibility of those of platforms to give a sense of perspective about the scale and the longevity? And is that another form of mis or disinformation?
Thank you so much. I think that gets to an important point about the way that algorithms work, because they essentially do what you've just described, which is they're going to repeatedly push you content that you express an interest in, and often that content will evolve or take you down a particular path, or in some cases become more extreme. And I've seen that firsthand with the kind of journalism that I've been doing. I run I have many old iPhones that I run called the Undercover Voters. I ran them around the UK election and in relation to the US election as well. So they're fictional characters I created based on data. They're private, they don't have any friends, but they have social media profiles across all the main sites. And what they've allowed me to do is to test and see what kinds of content different types of users are being recommended by the algorithms based on their preferences, their location, the kinds of content they show an interest in, their behavior, and so on and so forth. The reason I have to do that is because of the absence of information that is shared with us by the social media platforms. It's the only way of being able really to interrogate what people are being pushed. And what I've found from running those accounts over the course of the past year, or the American ones I've been running for longer, is what you describe, which is around particular issues. You come to see how a user will be recommended the same set of accounts, for example, on a site, who are posting content sometimes that becomes increasingly extreme, and so their perspective is distorted. And I think it's important to think about that in a number of ways. The first is that when people are being repeatedly recommended this kinds of content, so they're being recommended it, and I've spoken to particularly younger users who feel this to be the case, when they're being recommended content that's pushed directly to their feed, they feel as though it's intended for them, and that can make them feel as though it's something that they should believe or be interested in or like, because it's kind of based on their preferences. When I did a BBC Panorama in September, there's a teenager I spoke to, Kai in Manchester, who told me that it made him feel as though some violence and misogyny he'd been recommended was sort of intended for him. He should believe it, and he felt that was distorting the perception of some of his peers, and he'd had to speak to them about that because he didn't really want to be seeing this sorts of stuff. I think there's also a question about how we take our social cues, for people like that. He said to me, well, it distorts your sense of what's okay and what's not okay, because you see a video or a post has had thousands, millions in some cases of views, and it's where you take your social cues from. So you start to think that a particular narrative or rhetoric is normal and widespread, even if that's not necessarily the case. And I think the final way of thinking about it is in terms of the kind of, we talk about it a lot, but the rabbit holes that people end up down, the kinds of new content and places they're exposed to, and the way that someone can go from having kind of no interest in the topic at all to finding themselves believing something they never thought they would. During the election in the US, I spoke to two women who believed that Donald Trump's the assassination attempt on him was staged without any evidence to support that idea. And one of them was someone who'd never believed this stuff, but she had been repeatedly exposed to this idea and the dislike of Donald Trump, and that had kind of led her to the point where she thought something that what had happened hadn't happened.
Thank you. That's a full answer, but I think it's a very important point. It sounds like the answer to your question, Kit, is that we don't have any right to have a perspective. Now, I know Tom wants to come in briefly, and Martin.
And
then we'll go to John.
Thank you, Chair. I think one of the key points that's been made and was made by yourself is talking about what's happening in the US and how different countries are trying to regulate and get to grips with this issue. I'm just wondering, given the fact that it is an international issue and we're seeing foreign actors and states use mis and disinformation as a tool in the new sort of way of warfare that's done online, I'm just wondering, how is it possible or do you think it's possible for the UK to effectively try to regulate and manage and mitigate against this, particularly in light of what we're seeing with people like Elon Musk and Donald Trump now back in the White House, given the changes that we're seeing in other countries? Because we can do all we want in our country, but how do we insulate and collaborate with partners around the world to make sure stuff isn't spread from further afield?
I'll come to Imran and Joe on this. Let's start with Imran.
Well, so CCDH has offices in Brussels, in London, DC, and we've just opened Los Angeles, actually 2 days before the fire started, so not ideal timing. We speak to the European Union, the DSA. I'm heading to Cape Town in February to speak to their online safety folks. We've been working with Australia and New Zealand, which were actually ahead of the curve because of what happened in Christchurch. You know, Jacinda Ardern was incredibly forward-thinking in the Christchurch call. Australia has an e-safety commissioner, Julie Inman-Grant, who's doing extraordinary work out there as well. So there are countries seeking to legislate and regulate. For the main part, those people who focused on systems, on transparency, on meaningful accountability, one of the problems with this committee's questions today, and if you were to put them to the platforms, is that they could gaslight you by just saying to you, look, we take down 99%, guys. We're great. We've done them. Oh, you've had the gaslight. I could smell the residual aroma in the room. I wasn't sure if that was the mice or Meta. So, look, of course, we have this serious problem that they mark their own homework, they provide their own data. We've had no transparency. So meaningful accountability requires that transparency. So there are things you can do.
So Tom's question
in specific answer, look at what Brazil did with Elon Musk recently. Elon Musk said that he actually shut down X in Brazil because he was unwilling to comply with the law. It took him days before he turned around and had to comply with the law as laid out in Brazil. Now, I don't think the Brazilian law is a particularly good law because it actually allows them to take down individual bits of content, something that, as someone who believes in freedom of speech, which is a very profoundly British concept and a core value of our democracy, I am worried about something which says an individual bit of speech can be made illegal by the government unless it would be offline as well. But what we can see is that platforms are willing to bend. But you're absolutely right that the pandemic of disinformation that's spreading across our world, corrupting our information ecosystems, leading to the degradation of science, of truth, of democracy, of the values of our societies, is American. There's a reason I moved to DC in 2020, 6 months after opening CCDH. The platforms, the worst bad actors, the most sophisticated bad actors are weaponizing these spaces to spread disinformation, particularly race and identity-based hate disinformation, and the lawmakers who've most singularly failed to deal with this issue since 1996, which is the last time the United States Congress promulgated laws relating to online content, the Communications Decency Act 1996, Section 230. It is their problem. And, we have to be applying pressure as well on our friends in the United States to be doing the right thing.
Okay, thank you.
Very little to add to that. I completely agree. I think the only point I would make here is that there are friends to try and cooperate with, and you raised it in your question that there are very clearly adversarial states who are very explicitly, creating armies of people to try and sow this, and I don't think that there is any kind of an easy way out of that. So there is probably an acceptance that this will be a problem that will exist. There's, the idea of cooperating with Russia or North Korea or Iran, it's for the birds. So completely agree with those points, but it's not going to be a silver bullet.
But can we actually deal with this unless the US pulls its finger out, to put it bluntly?
You can do some things, but you can't fix the problem, but you can certainly mitigate it. And mitigating a problem is, just because you can't fully deal with something doesn't mean that you shouldn't take mitigation measures. This is, in some respects, we are at an early stage of regulation of what is a new problem in our societies. We should not be ashamed of the fact that we've made a noble attempt with the Online Safety Act on a multi-partisan basis to try and do the right thing, but we should be ready immediately to start to think about what we've missed, where the technology is moving on to, and whether or not it's working effectively, and to iterate and iterate and iterate again. And we're going to have to do that with this new and interesting and really, and also with all the positives that come with it. Let's not forget, these are great platforms. The ability to shrink the world, make Timbuktu seem as close as Tulsa, seem as close as Tyneside, is a wonderful thing.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing Tyneside into this.
Could I just make one sentence?
We appreciate your enthusiasm.
One sentence. It is about you in front of me. Brazil demonstrated that there is power to rein in. It is one thing to have an online safety act, it's another thing to enforce it.
The point I was going to make was that this committee is exactly looking at how we can ensure that the UK can make a difference, and particularly from the communities that we heard from earlier this morning, for the communities. Martin,
just a follow-up around that specific point.
Very, very briefly.
What exactly is the Online Safety Act missing that we should be bringing in?
Okay, can you answer that in 10 seconds?
In 10 seconds, what the Online Safety...
I think Imran did answer that earlier, effectively, yes, you did. Do you have something to add? Yeah.
I think my views will probably come up later. I think move on to, feel free.
Thank you. We've talked an awful lot about the business model of these platforms causing the behaviour that we're trying to examine. It's always a good rule, I find, to think about follow the money. Mr. Ahmed, you're the first person to talk about the advertisers, which I find slightly strange that no one has yet actually identified the behaviour of the paymasters in terms of actually funding this behaviour of the platforms. Is there anything we should be looking at in terms of either giving the advertisers more control over the way their adverts are placed, or indeed making them responsible for what they are funding? And is there any evidence that events like the riots actually make money for the people who are advertising?
Let me speak to the first bit, which is whether or not advertisers are happy about the situation. Absolutely not. So we work with the ISBA, which is the UK Advertising Industries lobbying body, and they are emphatic that they want to reduce the prevalence of advertising on malignant content, on hate content, on disinformation, on the sort of stuff that led to Southport. We were working with the Global Alliance for Responsible Marketing, which was a sub-unit of the World Federation of Advertisers based in New York, which was building assessments of what sort of content they would allow their ads to appear next to. The Global Alliance for Responsible Marketing, GARM, shut down last year after Elon Musk sued them for acting as a cartel which was stopping him from making money. He also sued advertisers for not advertising on his platform.
You didn't get very far.
It's like advertising someone, so it's like suing someone for not being your mate. People have the right to decide. In fact, bizarrely, the First Amendment right is with the advertiser to decide freedom of association is protected by the First Amendment. So, look, yes, absolutely they want. What we could do is open up the transparency on advertising. Advertisers at the moment don't know where their adverts appear. If there was an open database of what content was monetized by whom, we'd have more clarity and we'd have more accountability moments. Civil society, and you could ask a question to Nike, for example, in our last report. The last report that we did was actually on eating disorder content on YouTube. We found adverts for Nike appearing on content encouraging young girls to go on a 500 calorie a day diet, which will kill them over time. So would they be happy about that? Absolutely not. Did they know until that moment? Probably not. But once they do know, of course, then there is a considerable responsibility on them to do something about it. I think the irony is people call us censorship organisations and people say that we're studying censorship. We're not. We want a more informed discourse through greater transparency.
There is that question on advertising is really important when it comes, especially as it drives the business models. Would Joe or Mariana like to add anything?
No.
Okay. Steve, yeah. and then to John.
Just a very quick question. There's the real advertisers that have a problem, but there's also quite a lot of fake advertising using trusted brands. So I just wanted to bring it back to Mariana, actually, because my feed at the moment on X in particular is littered with ads that claim to be from the BBC and have the BBC branding, but are clearly not. And so, X clearly is allowing quite a lot of monetization and ad revenue to come from very, very obviously fake sort of ads. I mean, have you looked into that? Is that something you're interested in? Not necessarily just from a BBC perspective, but more broadly?
Yes, and I think actually it highlights something which we should be talking about, which is not just about the advertisers, which obviously is an important conversation about how this kind of content or how the platforms themselves are funded, but actually also, why do people make that kind of content you're describing? Well, because it will get eyeballs, it will get clicks, and as a consequence, they often are able to make money from that. And a lot of that comes down to the way that the social media platforms have often offered incentives for creators, influencers, and they've allowed people to be able to make money. In some cases, that's been a positive thing, and we've seen how people have been able to build kind of entire careers on the basis of their content. But you can also see the risk that that poses, and I've certainly seen that firsthand, not least around the riots, but also around the various elections. Take, for example, there was a site called Channel 3 Now, which was the pseudo news site, one of the first to share false claims about the identity of the attacker following the attack in Southport, because it looked credible, because it looked like a news site. Lots and lots of people were resharing it. When I tracked down the people behind that, and there'd been various accusations leveled at this site, including suggestions it was connected to Russia in some way, or it was part of a foreign influence operation. I didn't see any evidence of that, but what I did find from speaking to one of the people involved in the site, who was based in, there was one based in America, one in Pakistan, one was a hockey player in Nova Scotia, and essentially from the conversations I had, it appeared to be about clicks and money, because they knew that the quicker they put something out, whether it was true or not, the more money they could make. And the same applies to some of the big accounts I've tracked down and spoken to on X right now, some that are newly created, made in October, and yet are making thousands of dollars, if not more than that, from the content they're posting, including content that is not true or that has been accused of promoting hate as well. So I think there's what you're describing is actually symptomatic of the way that the social media sites, and if we talk about X specifically, they've made changes to how accounts can make money now. If you're a premium user, you sign up, you buy a blue tick, you're able to make money from other premium users interacting with your content. Obviously, the perhaps the more controversial or exciting or upsetting that content is, the more clicks and views you're going to get, and therefore the more money you can make. And so you can see how that motivates, and certainly it has quite explicitly motivated some of the people I've spoken to, who also appear to have ideological aims. I've contacted X quite a lot about this question around monetization. They have responded to one right of reply email I've sent them over the past, ever since Elon Musk took over, and I've probably sent upwards of definitely dozens of emails. So it's hard to get answers out of them, but they continue to say that they're defending the user's right to freedom of expression.
Yeah, so the transparency of that freedom of expression there has not been defended. John, we go to you now.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to pick up actually on something Dr. Whittaker had said earlier, but actually it's been touched on by Ms. Spring and Mr. Armin as well, in terms of there seems to be, I was struck by the old iPhones dotted around the country, the examples of Nike and so forth. Dr. Whittaker, you suggested that there were in effect that we hadn't got enough evidence of social media algorithms recommending harmful content. Why is that, and what are the gaps, and what would be helpful to us?
As with the Online Safety Act, the real key distinction here is to draw the line between illegal and what you might call legal but harmful content, which has actually been most of what we've been talking about today. Yes. Looking at the whole basis of academic and think tank research, there is not much evidence to suggest that illegal content is being amplified, but there is a bucket load of evidence to suggest that this kind of legal but harmful content is being amplified. Starting with illegal, one might take the optimistic view that social media platforms are so good at getting rid of illegal content that it's not there to be amplified. You might be able to detect a certain amount of sarcasm in our voice. But there is a really big knowledge gap when we're talking about things like terrorism, when we're talking about suicide content, all of these things. There's just not a lot of research there. When we talk about legal but harmful content, there's about 50 empirical studies, and most of them point to the fact that it is promoting in some way. However, my comments earlier are that there are some really big gaps that limit my ability as a researcher and all other researchers to do this. We've heard one already. Social media platforms have made it as difficult as possible for us to understand, for us to research internally. There's also, that basically means that almost every single study looks at YouTube, because for years YouTube had it's a bit technical, but had an API that means you can log on and look at these things. There's also a whole host of other issues. Almost every study is done in the English language. It's good when we're talking about the UK context, but when we're talking about, for example, genocide in Myanmar, and the things that the Facebook whistleblower evidence spoke about, well, guess what? It turned out there was only, I think, like 2 or 3 Bamar speakers doing content moderation on Facebook. So then when we talk about how things might be amplified and the ability to stem that flow when it becomes a problem. So English language, another big problem as well. And then finally, almost every study is what you might call a black box study, and this includes the ones that I've done. You feed try and change some things on social media and just see what the algorithm spits out at the end. Interesting, informative, but you're actually not able to understand what that algorithm is doing. There was one study under the previous ownership on Twitter where they actually used internal data and it revealed some really, really interesting things. But despite all of the studies pointing in a certain direction, there are some really major limitations that means that we should be cautious about the conclusions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And now, Adam, would you like to come up on that point?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And in response to the discussions we've been having, very positive generally, and we've talked lots about the Online Safety Act, but for us to take away as legislators, picking out some of the holes that we may or may not have identified in the Online Safety Act, where do you see the future of legislation to combat some of the issues that we're talking about?
So we've been doing some thinking around what we've called a project Online Safety Act 2.0. So what's the next iteration look like? And there are 3 key aspects that we need to deal with: algorithms and more transparency around that. Now look, the way the algorithms work, and part of the reason is that people call them a black box. The reason, even for the platforms themselves, they are unpredictable because they are so complex. It's not just one equation, it's lots of nested algorithms underneath each other. So when Meta, for example, studied QAnon and how someone could be radicalized into QAnon, they had to simulate, they created a profile for someone called Carol, and they then worked out how many steps it took for her to be radicalized. It took a week before her page was full of stuff that they said themselves broke their own rules. This was revealed by Frances Haugen.
Sorry, could we answer the question?
AI is the second part, and AI and having more clarity on and having more rules around that, and then finally on the advertising as well. If you did those 3 aspects and enhance the current transparency regime, the statutory data access pathways for researchers and for organisations like ourselves, I think those are things that are obvious right now and that absolutely, with alacrity, need to be fixed.
Great, thank you. Would you add to that anything?
Just very quickly,
and Mariana, yes.
Yeah, it won't surprise you to learn that I'm also in favour of researcher access to data. It's what we do. But the future of legislation is first and foremost finding ways to enforce the legislation that exists. It's one thing for, countries around the world are passing these kind of Online Safety Act type things. If they end up being toothless, it's not going to matter. And then in response to the earlier question, if America doesn't pull their finger out, are we doomed? Yes, if the legislation that is being passed around the world does not end up having teeth, we will be doomed. But these test cases.
Question, but we are running out of time. We have a number of questions to come. Mariana, is there anything that you would like to add?
Just very quickly, I mean, I think a lot has been said already, but just I think a couple of things that we haven't mentioned that I think are worth thinking about in terms of where we go in online safety. Something I spend quite a lot of time talking and thinking about is also social media literacy, and thinking about, for me, this keeps coming back to the algorithms, as I've been saying, and a lot of the solutions or ideas that are discussed sometimes feel like they're sort of band-aids on a gaping wound. And I think a lot of this is about obviously about accountability for the social media companies and feeling as though we can ask them difficult questions and they can answer those difficult questions, certainly as journalists, but also feeling like the public are equipped to, with the absence of that, equipped to deal with the kinds of content they're being pushed and recommended. And I hope in some way some of the work I do sort of functions a little bit like social media literacy, but I think that's something that's really valuable for politicians to be thinking about, because it's one of the best ways of guarding against some of the harms we've been discussing.
Yes, thank you for that. And we were aware that after the terrible killings in Southport, it was, I think, Twitter or X was recommending the false name of the supposed assailant, so it was trending, so it was actually being recommended to all ex-users. In the light of your answer to that last question, an important question on future legislation, I just want to raise and you touched on it briefly, Imran, but the issue of generative AI affecting the production and spread of misleading and harmful content online. And here I'm thinking such as the search, Google search, responding with discredited racial ethnic theories when asked about the IQ of different countries. I'm also thinking of what the BBC, is it Apple, who was responding or trying to synthesize BBC headlines in a way which led to misinformation. So would you add, in terms of future legislation, would you add any other additional points to address specifically generative AI?
So, I mean, generative AI is just the core problem is with all of this is the friction and the speed and the cost of producing and distributing disinformation. So social media reduces the cost for every marginal user and every marginal message. It reduces the cost to zero of spreading disinformation. The current cost of spreading disinformation on social media is the production side. Generative AI reduces the marginal cost of producing every new message to zero. A very, very basic script that you could write for producing disinformation is to get generative AI to produce 1,000 different iterations of a message to disinform people, to put that on social media, see the engagement levels, and use that data to feed back to continue to refine through the generative AI algorithm the disinformation itself. So you have sort of a perpetually improving disinformation machine. Should we be dealing with that? Clearly, having just described that we are essentially in the thermonuclear age of disinformation, it is time that we have something in place with generative AI. And the two problems there are guardrails in terms of what they output and curation of what's input into those models. Unless there is more clarity, again, transparency helps here. Transparency on how they curate the content they put in and transparency on the guardrails that they have on what is outputted allows for a rich and informed dialogue with civil society and lawmakers on how those platforms should be designed and what the limits on them should be. One very good example I can give you is the study that we did on generative AI and eating disorders. We asked a bunch of generative AI platforms that we were a young girl, we want to know how we can lose weight. One of the platforms said, why don't you try heroin? Another said, why don't you try ingesting a tapeworm egg? Another one said, wrote us a plan for an 800 calorie a day diet, which will kill someone over a period of time.
Thank you. Thank you. Joe?
Yeah, so, look, I'm a terrorism extremism researcher first and foremost, and when we look at these kind of bad actors operating in this space, they are clearly all starting to adopt generative AI. Now, some of the biggest concerns are perhaps not the best founded. There were these concerns of jihadists resurrecting bin Laden to try and radicalize people. That's not, and you see headlines and things like that. That is not the concern here. What it is exactly as Imran suggests, is the ability to do things at a much, much greater pace. So when you've got, for example, transnational terrorist organizations, the ability to translate your propaganda into 24 different languages in a matter of seconds does provide opportunities that you wouldn't necessarily have had before. The creation of deepfakes is something we are seeing as well, specifically from a terrorism extremism perspective. And that's something which will need to be dealt with. One thing I would suggest is the guardrails are currently all operated under a self-regulatory method. Right. We trust ChatGPT, and it has got better at stopping going from bad places. But as a citizen, I want a government to have signed off and they be conforming to a regulatory scheme.
Okay, that's very good. Mariana, would you add anything?
Yes, I think it's interesting kind of thinking about the arc to what was just being said there about generative AI and the kind of real fears people had about the impact it could have on the spread of disinformation and actually how that's panned out. Most of the cases and examples that I investigated over the past year that involved particularly sort of deep faked images or audio being created. They were only effective because this kind of content was recommended by the algorithms to a widespread audience. To the question before about the sort of distortion of perspective, that people were primed and ready to see this kind of content and it perhaps confirmed their biases. So I looked at AI generated images, for example, of Donald Trump alongside black voters created by his supporters, which when I spoke to them, some voters who'd seen this kind of content, was effective only when it seemed to play into their existing biases and they were being pushed it, and then they believed it to be real and to confirm their perception of the individual. But the most worrying examples that I've seen involve, there was a clip I investigated of London Mayor Sadiq Khan making comments that he never made about a pro-Palestinian march being moved to accommodate Armistice Day celebration. And that was effective because it was recommended and pushed and spread in places where people were primed to believe it, and it played into their existing perceptions. And it had a real world consequence. It appeared to exacerbate tensions offline. So I think that this is just another thing that's been flung into what, as we've already discussed, is a pretty complicated and messy social media ecosystem.
Great. Thank you. I think there's some lessons for all, important suggestions for us, for the committee to look at when it comes to generative AI specifically. But now I want to go to Paul as a practicing or previously practicing journalist to raise the issues around freedom of expression and misinformation.
Yeah, can I ask you both, Imran and Joe, you've referred to the fact, Imran, rightly to the fact that freedom of speech is a very British value, and you've also referred to the American constitutional protections. How can a UK government tackle misinformation and disinformation without infringing on freedom of expression? I'm thinking in particular that there are some free speech absolutists who say that the Prime Minister was wrong the other week when he said that freedom of expression does not include the freedom to spread lies. Some absolutists would say it does include that freedom to spread lies, as long as it doesn't have a causal link to harm or harassment or violence. What's your answer to those?
So I'm going to ask Mariana to start, and then Joe and Imran, briefly if you can, but this is obviously a particularly important issue for the committee, and it's also, I should say, we are still in discussions with X as to who will appear on their behalf for the committee.
Yeah, and thank you for that question. And I think that perhaps it's been widely accepted that stuff that is not true and that is harmful in different ways will exist on social media because of the scale of social media, because of how many people can use it, because of how it works, that it doesn't rely so much on proactive moderation as reactive moderation to content. But I think the question here is the right for those lies to be seen by as many people as they are. And this again comes back to the algorithms, which is, if a post is untrue or false and it's seen by 10 people, that's a completely different kettle of fish to if it's seen by 10 million people. And what we're seeing right now on some social media platforms, X is an example of that, is where content, whether it's true or not, can be amplified, recommended. And I've seen ample evidence to support this idea. I've even spoken to people behind accounts who acknowledge this is the case, that whether it's true or not, they know that their posts can be seen by millions of people. They can make money from it. And there's no real repercussions. There might be a community note that's added to a post, so that's other users fact-checking that post. But the problem is, again, that often when a post has already been seen that many times, the impact has already been felt, and there are real questions about to what extent any labelling or fact-checking actually succeeds in correcting the narrative.
Yeah, so I think part of what you're saying is often referred to as you have the right to freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. And I suppose the question is, how should that non-right to freedom of reach be mediated? Imran, would you like to add anything? And then I'll come to Joe.
Yeah, I mean, Paul, I think that we have the debate on this issue has become really convoluted and complex. One of the reasons I blame for this is the invention of the terms misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation means being wrong. It's an untruth. Disinformation adds in mens rea. It's a lie. It's an intention to deceive. And I think that, people have a fundamental right to express both. They do, by law. They have the right to lie about whether or not a Muslim was behind, an asylum seeker was behind the events in Southport. But algorithms, they lie specifically, when they select misinformation and when they know that the most violative content is the stuff that gets the most engagement, when they then choose to reward that engagement with amplification, it is the design of these systems that is, it adds in the mens rea aspect to it. So perhaps people, can be wrong, they can be stupid, people have the right to be dumb, but platforms know better, and they already know that they are complicit in the promotion of that misinformation, right. And in doing so, it becomes disinformation. These are disinformation machines, right. And so the framework that CCDH has always had is don't criminalise speech. That's a bananas thing to do. Safety is created by transparency, which allows for meaningful accountability, and then when there is clear evidence of negligence, which is a core concept under British civil law as well, or of knowing indifference to where that disinformation may lead to human harm, then there should be costs attached to that. Like, we should either impose them through one mechanism being through regulatory costs. The second mechanism is a market cost, which is that by creating transparency for the advertisers too, they can withdraw their revenues. So it's a double way of impacting the bottom line and of changing the system, because right now the problem is that Southport was profitable for X and the other platforms. And we need to make sure that in future it's costly, whether that's through the advertising and through a transparency-enabled system which allows for an open and informed discourse on these issues, or it is if there is sufficient evidence of mens rea, and there may be in the case of X for regulatory costs too.
I think what we're hearing is that there's no cost to lying, but there are revenues associated with lying. Joe, would you like to add anything just briefly to that?
Yeah. The internet has fundamentally changed how we deal with issues of free speech. We've got 2,500 years of philosophy and law trying to work out, there's the state, here's the people. People occasionally say something's over the line, get punished. And then since about 1995, there's been this third part of the triangle of these tech companies. And for about 25 years, we've been outsourcing our free speech public square discussions to people that are situated in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, to make those kind of decisions for us. We are now, within the last 3 or 4 years, both the EU, the UK, Australia, devising laws which do fundamentally change that kind of calculation. I am actually quite distrustful of the phrase freedom of speech doesn't equal freedom of reach. I think actually it is a healthy sign of a functioning democracy, not only that all views are heard and there is some kind of equality in the way that different views are heard, but actually there should be some instances in which certain kinds of fringe views are actively promoted in some way. So if you think about, for example, the BBC, they will always do their best to try and get a range of different types of views on any one issue. So that, and I think that same sort of principle can extend to algorithms. I actually think that we've got a common law system which deals with these sorts of things quite well. If speech is so reckless that it is putting people in danger, that is the sort of speech that should be outlawed, and there is no reason why platforms should be immune from that. It is the adage, the century-old adage of falsely shouting fire in a crowded theatre. Yeah. There is so much speech that took place and that people have been sentenced for around the riots that was exactly that. So it is in some way just about enforcing the long-standing laws that have been built up over several hundreds of years.
Finding new ways to adapt. Very briefly.
Very brief final one to Mariana. We're talking a lot about the business models and about the algorithms and the computerization of this process. But what about the human element? In other words, the Facebook community groups. There are many, many tens of thousands of them in every town and city up and down Britain. And they're often controlled by a handful of 2 or 3 individuals who are the admins to these groups. Yeah. What is the role that they should have in any kind of regulation or legislation? Or what threat have you seen of how they filter these messages rather than just the algorithm?
Yeah, I think you're right. So obviously people can be kind of recommended specific groups that might be relevant to them. Particularly, like you say, sort of local groups or places where they might actually know some of the people involved. And I think the risk posed by those groups, there can be a really positive community resource in lots of ways, but the risk posed by them, and this extends beyond any one particular social media platform, anywhere where you can join a large channel or group where you might have stuff in common with people, you might share either views or a local area. It all comes back to this question of trust, and the risk that they pose is that you're more inclined to trust people either that you know or you feel are perhaps more similar to you, or people that you agree with. And so they create an environment in which, and we've seen this particularly around, I spent quite a lot of time looking into frenzies that occur on social media around disappearances, or when something bad happens, when a family is often affected by, particularly when there's a disappearance or there aren't answers. And you find that this kind of new genre of sleuth online sort of detective gets involved. That's happened not just in groups, across the board, people making videos, their own kinds of content. But people, particularly in these kinds of environments, feel as though they can put forward ideas. And that's often, that's again, their kind of right to freedom of expression, put forward ideas, but actually that end up not being true and can actually cause harm to the people who are often experiencing something really terrible. And so I think that whenever you're thinking about all of the different social media platforms and the kinds of content on them and the spaces that exist, it's really important to understand how each of them kind of function and how each of them permit the proliferation of stuff that might not be true or might be harmful or unhelpful. And I think groups definitely sort of fall into that category, particularly ones that are harder to enter and are closed or private in some way.
Thank you very much, Mariana. We are past time, but I do just want to give each of you opportunity to tell the committee, and there should be a maximum of 5 words each, if you like, which organisations, which bodies do you think the committee should be holding accountable for the spread of misinformation? Identify government organisations, private sector organisations, community organisations or groups, but if you could tell the committee who you think we should be holding accountable. So I'm going to start with you, Imran, first.
Starts with the social media companies. They are the primary offender in the violence that we've seen last summer, but also in the increasing spread of disinformation online. Right. I think second of all, you've got to treat the mainstream broadcasters as complicit too. They have been just as complicit in reporting which reifies trends on social media into facts in the mainstream media too. People are saying on Twitter, and the third people are yourselves, the politicians, who spend far too much time there are people who have opportunistically weaponized trends on social media to spread disinformation and to tell other people that they believe in it too, and therefore they're on their side. And we've seen that whether it's come to anti-Semitism, it's come to Islamophobia, anti-vax disinformation, and all sorts of other malignancies. And I think we need to be holding ourselves to a different set of standards.
Okay, that's great. Politicians, social media companies, and a third one. Joe?
Just the only thing to add is the people who are out there committing violence as well. It's very easy to get lost in that when we're talking about big social media platforms. There were thousands of people out there committing violence last summer.
Finally, Mariana.
I would say that it's really important to be able to hold the social media companies accountable for the way that these algorithms and systems work. I think it's really important to hold the people who are spreading this kind of content, pushing it, promoting it, accountable, but it's also important to understand why this is happening. And I think that approach is something that I really favour. I think it's important to ask questions of politicians and everyone else who has a part to play in this. And I guess my final plea to you would just be that, as someone who spends a lot of time meeting the real people who are affected by this stuff, whether it's that they believe it or harmed by it, families affected, communities affected, they often feel like they're becoming ping pong balls in a bit of a sort of political game, really, whether it's the debate about freedom of expression or everything else. And my just one thing that I think is important is to kind of stick up for them and to say that they don't feel like anybody is listening to them, particularly not the social media companies. And so it would be good if someone did listen to them.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank all members of our panel. On that last point, I think the committee, all the committee members feel very strongly that it is part of our job to be standing up for those who are impacted by the spread of misinformation on social media. We've very much valued your evidence. You've raised a number of really important issues and points which I think had not been raised before, from how we monitor misinformation in the UK and globally, and the right to assess and research on social media, what duty do we have as individuals, and the transparency, particularly the transparency of algorithms and the connection to the advertising revenues. It's been a series of very powerful testimonies, we could go on for a lot longer. But thank you so much for your contribution. And with that, I will just say order.